It started with a sound, a grinding, piercing noise that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Within seconds, CIA officers stationed in Havana felt pressure building in their skulls. Some described it as a beam pointed directly at one side of their head. Others just dropped to the floor, dizzy, disoriented, unable to stand. Over the next 8 years, more than 1,000 American and Canadian officials would report the same thing. In Cuba, China, Russia, Germany, Colombia, and even on the White House lawn, the US government would spend hundreds of millions of dollars, deploy the CIA, the FBI, and 7 separate intelligence agencies, and still walk away without a straight answer. So today we're asking the question nobody in Washington seems able to answer. Were American spies secretly being attacked? And if not, what most likely happened to them? Let's put a face on this. In December 2017, a CIA officer named Mark Polymeropoulos landed in Moscow for a routine work trip. He was, by his own account, no stranger to danger. He'd spent years running clandestine operations through the war zones of Iraq and Afghanistan. That night in his hotel room, he woke up with a case of vertigo so severe it felt, in his words, like being on a carnival ride. Ringing ears, nausea, pressure behind his eyes. He shook it off as food poisoning. It happened again 2 nights later, mid-dinner with embassy officials. He'd go on to spend years chasing a diagnosis, and he'll come back into this story more than once because his case ends up being one of the most closely examined in the entire saga. His experience wasn't the first, though. A year earlier, in late 2016, American and Canadian diplomats stationed in Havana, Cuba, began reporting nearly identical symptoms. Some after hearing a loud, directional, high-pitched drone that seemed to come from one specific spot in a room, almost like a beam. By mid-2017, the story had leaked. Washington slashed embassy staff and expelled Cuban diplomats in retaliation. At least 26 personnel and family members were affected in that first wave. What changed the story from a strange illness in Cuba to something much bigger was hard medical evidence. A 2018 University of Pennsylvania study scanned the Havana patients' brains and found measurable physical differences compared to healthy people. Not just symptoms people described, but something doctors could see. That single finding is why this case never got dismissed as imagination. It's also around this time that a US consular officer in Guangzhou, China, reported the exact same combination of sound, pressure, and dizziness. Proof this wasn't confined to one embassy. Then came the moment that gave the attack theory its scientific backbone. In December 2020, a National Academies of Sciences panel concluded that directed pulsed radiofrequency energy appears to be the most plausible mechanism behind the acute cases, citing the Frey effect, where pulsed microwave energy can create the sensation of sound directly inside the skull. No actual noise needed. Still, the panel named no device and no perpetrator. By 2021, the geography had become impossible to ignore. Dozens of cases in Vienna and, most alarmingly, incidents reported on or near the White House grounds itself. Congress passed the Havana Act that year, guaranteeing compensation for victims like Polymeropoulos, who by then had already retired from the CIA, unable to keep working through the headaches. Then CIA Director William Burns privately told colleagues he saw a very strong possibility the cases were intentional attacks. But the intelligence community was heading somewhere else entirely. On March 1, 2023, after years of investigating nearly 1,000 cases, 5 of 7 US agencies concluded it was very unlikely a foreign adversary was behind any of it. For Polymeropoulos and hundreds like him, that finding felt like a door slamming shut. Then in March 2024, it swung back open. A joint investigation by The Insider, 60 Minutes, and Der Spiegel, led by journalists Christo Grozhev and Michael Weiss, claimed to have geolocated members of a Russian military intelligence unit, GRU Unit 29155, near multiple incident sites years and 1,000 miles apart, along with paperwork showing an officer was paid a bonus for work on non-lethal acoustic weapons. Greg Edgreen, the Pentagon's former lead investigator, went further, telling 60 Minutes he believed the US was under attack from Russia, and that officers who'd hurt Russian operations the most, like Polymeropoulos in Moscow, were disproportionately represented among the sick. The government still didn't budge. A January 25 review again called foreign involvement very unlikely, though two agencies for the first time gave roughly even odds that an adversary had developed, not necessarily used, a novel weapon. And in early 2026, 60 Minutes reported something new. Homeland Security agents had covertly purchased a miniaturized microwave weapon from a Russian criminal network capable of producing exactly these symptoms, though not tied to any specific attack. Polymeropoulos, still fighting for full recognition of his case, called the years of official denial a cover-up. That's where things stand today. No weapon recovered from an actual crime scene, no perpetrator formally named, and a growing gap between what victims like Polymeropoulos believe happened to them and what 7 government agencies are willing to say out loud. Theory 1. Directed energy weapon attack. The strongest point in this theory's favor is that it's the US government's own scientific panel that built it. The National Academy specifically named directed pulsed radio frequency energy as the most plausible mechanism, and the fray effect, sound perceived inside the skull from microwave pulses, is documented peer-reviewed science, not speculation. But its biggest weakness is glaring. After nearly a decade of searching, no agency, journalist, or scientist has ever recovered an actual device, intercepted a signal, or produced physical proof that such a weapon was fired at anyone. Theory 2. Russian GRU Unit 29155 operation. This theory's strongest point is specificity. It names a real unit with a documented history of poisonings and sabotage, backs it with travel records placing officers near incident locations, and even surfaces paperwork referencing a bonus for non-lethal acoustic weapons research. Greg Edgreen's observation that top Russia-focused officers like Polymeropoulos were disproportionately affected adds a chilling, motive-driven logic. Its biggest weakness is that even the journalists behind it admit the evidence is circumstantial. Officers being in the same city is not the same as officers deploying a weapon, and no intercepted order or confirmed device has ever surfaced. Theory 3. Mass psychogenic illness. The strongest point here comes from neurologist Robert Ballo and sociologist Robert Bartholomew, who note that despite years of claims about brain injury, most MRI scans on affected personnel came back normal. And the abnormalities that did appear are commonly seen in ordinary stress and anxiety disorders. They also point out that the FBI's own early classified assessment in 2018 favored psychogenic illness and called microwave radiation highly unlikely. The weakness, though, is that this theory struggles to fully explain cases like Polymeropoulos's, where an independent military medical team diagnosed a mild traumatic brain injury tied to an external exposure event, a formal physical diagnosis that doesn't fit neatly into a psychological explanation. Theory 4. Environmental and medical coincidence. This theory's strongest point is its evidence trail on the ground in Havana itself. Audio recordings of the original sonic attack were later shown to closely match the mating call of a local cricket species, undercutting the idea of a sophisticated weapon at the very first incident. It also matches the US government's own language, which attributes many cases to pre-existing conditions, conventional illnesses, and environmental factors. Its weakness is scale. Crickets and coincidence explain a handful of ambiguous early cases in one location, but they don't obviously explain incidents reported years apart in Vienna, Guangzhou, and the White House grounds. If we apply Occam's razor, favoring the explanation that requires the fewest assumptions, the directed energy attack theory runs into trouble immediately. It requires believing a foreign adversary built and deployed an advanced weapon, undetected dozens of times, across a dozen countries, over 8 years, without a single agency ever recovering a physical trace of it. That's not one leap, that's a chain of them. The Russian Unit 29155 theory is the most compelling version of the attack case precisely because of what we covered in the timeline and theories above. Named suspects, travel records, a suggestive paycheck. But as even its own investigators concede, this remains circumstantial. 7 US intelligence agencies, with access to satellite imagery, signals intelligence, and human sources no journalist has, spent years hunting for exactly this kind of evidence and came back mostly empty-handed. If Russia's most notorious sabotage unit had really pulled off dozens of undetected long-range attacks on US soil and abroad, it would rank among the most stunning intelligence failures in American history. And the same agencies that would be most embarrassed by admitting that failure are the ones telling us it very likely didn't happen. That leaves the two less cinematic theories, and this is where the evidence actually clusters most convincingly, with one important exception we need to address directly: Mark Polymeropoulos. Polymeropoulos remains one of the hardest cases to explain. Unlike many reported incidents, he was alone in a Moscow hotel room and later received a diagnosis from an independent military medical team linking his condition to an external exposure event. That makes his case harder to dismiss than many others. But it ultimately runs into the same wall every theory does. No recovered device, no witnessed attack, and no confirmed perpetrator. The broader picture, though, points in a different direction. The vast majority of the roughly 1,000 reported cases occurred across embassies and government postings with no obvious strategic value, often after personnel had been told to watch for symptoms and report them. Taken together with the Havana cricket recordings, the FBI's early psychogenic assessment, and years of intelligence investigations that failed to identify a weapon or attacker, the evidence fits more comfortably with a combination of ordinary environmental factors, chronic stress, and mass psychogenic illness than with a coordinated campaign of directed energy attacks. None of this makes Polymeropoulos or anyone else who got sick a liar. As Bartholomew himself has said, psychogenic symptoms are as real as any other medical condition. The difference is in where they originate, not whether they exist. It also doesn't fully close the book on the unresolved subset the government itself flags, where two agencies now put the odds at roughly even that some adversary has developed, even if not necessarily used, a novel weapon. But weighing the full picture, no recovered device tied to an actual attack, a cricket recording that matches the sound, a leaked FBI report favoring psychogenic causes, and years of the best-resourced intelligence agencies on a planet failing to confirm what journalists claim to have partly pieced together with open-source tools, the version of events requiring the fewest leaps isn't a corroborated Russian campaign against American spies. It's a smaller core of real, unexplained injury, surrounded by a much larger wave of genuine human suffering with an unglamorous cause. Stress, suggestion, and a media environment primed to call it a spy thriller. Were American spies secretly being attacked? For most of the 1,000+ reported cases, most likely not. But for a handful, including the man who woke up in a Moscow hotel room in December 2017 and never fully recovered, the honest answer is that nobody, not the CIA, not the journalists, not the victims themselves, actually know for certain. And after 8 years and hundreds of millions of dollars, that uncertainty says almost as much about American institutions as it does about whatever really happened.